more, it's almost guaranteed to be 1.85 to 1. Which is very rare. Actually, it's not rare. It's just not very common, but it's definitely not rare. So you still will resize. You'll crop it to whatever the fuck you need to crop it to get rid of the black borders. Whatever it is, go ahead and crop it, and you will still scale it back to 720 by 480. Now, here's the only time you will not crop back to 720 by 480. Is very widescreen movies. This is a 2.35 to 1 aspect ratio. See how wide this is? This is just as wide as the rest of the movies, but it is not as tall. That's because it's a very fucking wide movie. This is called 2.35 to 1 ratio. You will sometimes see a 2 to 1 ratio, which is rare, very rare. Sometimes a 2.21 to 1, which is very rare. The most common, very widescreen, is 2.35 to 1. If it's very widescreen like this, wider than obviously wider than normal, clearly wider than normal, it's 2.35 to 1, almost guaranteed. Unless your movie's from like the 50s and 60s era, then it might be what was it? A 2.49 to 1, 2.5 to 1. But we won't even touch that. Remember, 2.35 to 1. This movie, when you scale and crop these movies, they're typically going to be goddamn close to 720 wide by 368 tall. Almost guaranteed. 368. Sometimes you'll crop it down to 366, 364, 362, 360, 358, 356. Something close. Maybe even 370. But you're going to scale it to 720 wide by 368 tall. Because 720 by 368 is even numbers of 16 wide and tall. It's even multiples of 16 macro blocks. And it's also correct. I mean, that's what its original resolution is supposed to be. Like I said, they add big-ass black borders, usually 54 pixel black borders to the top and bottom. But anyway, I don't have a really widescreen movie with me. But if I did, your filter chain, remember, full screen movies, 1.33 to 1 or 4:3 ratio, full screen, square looking movies are going to be scaled back to 720 by 480. Widescreen movies are going to be scaled back to 720 by 480. Slightly wider screen movies that I just mentioned have a slightly more of a top and bottom border than they do left and right, if they even have a left and right. Those are 1.78 to 1 instead of those are 1.85 to 1. Those are still going to be scaled back to 720 by 480. But the big widescreen movies here, your crop is going to look something like 720. Unless there's a border on the left and right, it's going to be like something close to 720 by 368. And whatever your offset is for left and right, if any, it's usually 0. And whatever your offset for vertical is usually something close to 54, because it's usually about a 54 pixel on the top and black border on the top and bottom. Then your scale is usually going to look like 720, or it's going to be, period, 720 colon 368. That's for the big widescreen movies, 2.35 to 1. All right. That's how you understand the difference between aspect ratios and all that other shit. A lot of movies on the back of the DVD will tell you the aspect ratio, but they mislead you. If it says full screen, you can be rest assured that it is full screen. It's 1.33 to 1 or 4:3. You can be rest assured that's correct. If it says widescreen, that could be 3 different things. And that's what pisses me off. Because in DVD, remember, there's only 2 aspect ratios it can display. So it doesn't matter if it's 1.78 to 1, 1.85 to 1, or 2.35 to 1. It's all called widescreen. It does not, there is no difference. It's all called widescreen. But sometimes on a DVD, on the back of it, you'll be lucky enough to where they'll actually give you the correct aspect ratio. It'll call it widescreen, but then it'll also say 1.85 to 1 instead of 1.78 to 1, or instead of 16:9, or it'll say 2.35 to 1. Don't count on that. Always learn to recognize this shit for yourself. Don't count on somebody else telling you what it is. Alright, remember, always scale back to even increments of 16. Now you know how to scale. Remember, everything is 720 by 480. Everything except extremely widescreen movies. Those are 720 by 368. Remember all that shit. And I'm going to try to write this down on my the web pages where I cover these videos. All right, now the next thing we got to move on to is how the hell to filter out interlaced and teleassigned content. Your crop and scale is usually going to be the end of the filter chain, or the middle of the filter chain. You always, if you have teleassigned or interlaced content, you always have to filter those first. Now, if you remember, this Cops and Robbers video was actually progressive all the way through, so we don't need to filter that. The frame, anything about the frames, the frame information, we don't need to filter anything out. But we're going to pretend, for the sake of argument, that we do. Now, I told you before in an earlier video how to recognize the difference between interlaced, progressive, teleassigned content. I told you how to recognize that stuff. I'm not going to tell you in this video, but I'm going to tell you how to filter each one. Progressive, there's no filter. You don't need a filter at all. But if you want to be safe, you can apply the teleassign filter, reverse teleassign filter, to progressive content without harming it. It won't harm it at all, and it barely even takes any CPU overhead. So it's safe to use the deteleassign filter on progressive content if you want to be safe. And it obviously, you'll have to use it on teleassign content to filter it into progressive content. The interlace filter is only used on shit that's interlaced, period. Don't use it on anything else. Now, if your content is interlaced all the way through, remember, I told you before how to recognize that. We're not going to go over it again. But assuming you know how to recognize it, and you determine that it is interlaced, the very first filter in your filter chain needs to be the YADIF filter. Y-A-D-I-F. Yet another de-interlace filter. So it should be VF, your dash VF for your video filter chain, space YADIF. Y-A-D-I-F, comma, and then any other filters you're using. And oh, I should also mention, sometimes if you're lucky on a DVD, there are no black borders. Some of the widescreen movies and some of the full screen movies, there are no borders. And so you don't have to crop or scale. You can leave the crop and scale filters out. Only if there's no borders. Only if you do not have to crop any black borders out. Alright, so YADIF, if you are de-interlacing, which if your DVD is from like the 60s, 70s, 80s, or even a modern DVD of content that was meant to be produced on television, is probably going to be teleassigned or interlaced, and it always has to, YADIF always has to be the very first filter in the filter chain. And that way all the rest of the filters are operating on full progressive frames when they operate on your picture information, because it's already been de-interlaced. Alright, if it's teleassigned, you need to apply two filters. One is called pull-up, P-U-L-L-U-P, comma, that's the pull-up filter. When they apply the teleassigned process, they do a pull-down process, which, if you remember before how I told you, they take the fourth frame and they pull down the fields into top and bottom fields. They separate the fourth frame and make it into a fourth and fifth frame of fields. That's called the pull down process. They pull down half a field of information and duplicate it into a fifth frame. So every fourth frame is duplicated into a half a fourth and a half of a fifth frame of top and bottom field information respectively. That's called the pull down process. To reverse it, you use the pull up filter. So your reverse video filter in your filter chain will be pull up, all one word, comma for the next filter, and then soft, S-O-F-T, skip, S-K-I-P, and then comma, and then the rest of your filters. Soft skip, if you remember before, I mentioned the DVD files will have a flag in them telling the DVD player software to interlace this shit as it plays it. Or yeah, there you go. That was right. To interlace it as it plays it. That's called soft teleassigned. Soft skip tells M-Player to ignore that flag. If you use the pull-up filter, you have to use soft skip afterwards. Otherwise, it could crash the encoder because Well, I just don't know. I'm not going to pretend to know. But they are used together. Pull up, comma, soft skip, comma, the rest of your video filters. All right. And like I said, that's for telesyn content. Shit that keeps switching frame rate. That's telesyn. Now, at the end of your filter chain, you put a comma. Again, you're going to have your and I've had videos where it's very, very rare to find a video